architecture is one thing, being a great designer is the other thing, but you need to essentially be able to, for lack of a better term, sell your work. So I'm really looking for things outside the box, understanding numbers, finances, budgets, how to ask for money in an appropriate way also helps me win work with my private clients.
Hello, Architect Nation, and welcome back. Ryan Willard here, Principal Partner at Business of Architecture. Today, you'll discover how one architect escaped the rat race without missing a paycheck. Have you ever dreamed of breaking free from the limitations of traditional practice, but felt overwhelmed by the risks of going solo? Do you ever wonder if there's a smarter way to build wealth as an architect without grinding away on clients' projects forever? Well, today on the episode, you're going to discover the unconventional path one architect took to go from employee to entrepreneur without missing a paycheck, a little known strategy for acquiring property that lets you develop projects with minimal upfront capital, and what Frank Lloyd Wright understood about business that most architects still haven't figured out. Today, we're talking with Matthew Arnold, the founder of Arnold and an architecture and development business in Boston. Matthew designs buildings and also helps bring them to life. He focuses on projects in his own neighborhood, making sure they fit well and work smoothly. Today's episode is sponsored by The Smart Practice. As a reminder, if you haven't already watched the free firm owner masterclass on the Smart Practice method, well, what are you waiting for? Discover how to eliminate overwhelm and slay chaos in your practice so you can focus on the architecture again. As always, make sure you listen all the way to the end and catch important listener-only bonuses and information. Get ready for an inspiring conversation packed with game-changing insights. Let's do it. Matthew, welcome to the Business of Architecture. How are you?
I'm excellent. Excellent. Happy to be here. I do have
Ver-
to say, first time, long time, if that makes any sense to you.
First time caller, long time listener.
Absolutely. I'm glad you know that.
No, I love it. No, very, very glad. Thank you very much for your support with the podcast and being a listener. And I was very excited when I got your message and you responding to our call out for architects, developers, and you yourself. You're an architect. You worked for David Hassin for many years and done lots of exciting projects there. And we'll talk a little bit about your kind of background there. But more recently, sort of middle of last year, is it, that you went out on your
Correct.
own
Correct.
and you've adopted the kind of the dream business model of many firm owners, of the architect developer, and we can go into that a little bit and just kind of understand why you felt that was a good business model for you and what you've done in preparation to kind of making that move from a firm like David's, which is kind of internationally recognized firm that many people would give a limb to work at, and very sort of exciting projects. And I know from speaking with him as well that typically team members there don't leave,
Very true.
which is testament to the kind of place that it is to work at. So welcome,
Thank you.
and perhaps we can. My first question is, why did you set up on your own? What's the backstory here? How did this come about?
Well, I had been working for David for almost the last 15 years. Like you said, great place, great man. He's a mentor. He is my mentor. He was my professor in grad school at Northeastern and kind of hired me in 2009 when there wasn't much going on in the world. Said, "Hey, do you want a job? Come work with me." I went there and I kind of never left. And he was really just a great mentor and now a great friend. But I always kind of in the back of my mind had the dream of running my own practice, right? I grew up in a household that my stepfather ran a construction company, and I saw him kind of be his own boss. My father, kind of in his industry, was very much his own boss as well. And I always just kind of had that looming idea in the back of my head that, I would run my own office someday. And honestly, last year I was kind of really struggling and grappling with what to do. Like, I really loved being at Hassin and I love David and I love the folks there. They're my family. They always will be. But there was still this kind of looming, voice in the back of my head saying, you still have your own dream. There's still time for you to live it out. And it was just kind of there. And I tried to silence it for many years, but it
Yeah.
just kept on nagging me. Honestly, I had an opportunity to go up to Taliesin West last
Oh,
year with Lutron Lighting. Yeah.
oh,
Lutron
amazing.
Lighting outfitted Taliesin West with Ketra lights, these beautiful adjustable light fixtures. They asked me if I wanted to go out with a bunch of other architects, interior designers, and lighting designers and spend 3 days out there. I said yes. I went out, had a pretty magical and like just reinvigorating experience. It really was so empowering to go into that space, walk into his studio and feel the things that he intended you to feel all those years ago. And it was still so relevant today. And I don't know, it just like I was so reinvigorated and re-inspired about the architecture profession. I came home and I was like, I think I need to start my own office. And, I told my wife, and she was like, yeah, you should do it. I've always been very entrepreneurial. I did bring in a significant amount of work to Hassan, because I do like being out. I like talking to people. I'm a people centric person. Like I
Uh-huh.
say, I'm a pack animal. I don't roll by myself very well. You can ask my wife. I drive her insane constantly. She's like, "Can you just go play with your friends and leave me alone?" Because I really do. So many people are good with people, but they're exhausted by people.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I came home from that trip and my wife was like, "What is up with you?" Blah, 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 blah. I just like spinning with ideas and just so inspired and reinvigorated about the world of architecture.
Okay.
And it just became so crystal clear that like I needed to do this.
What
And
what what was it? What was it about seeing Taliesin that kind of really reignited this love of architecture and possibility? And and what did you see that was kind of, possible for you as a practicing architect and as a business owner?
right. And a good question. Yeah. I think what became clear to me was like Frank Lloyd Wright. And we also went to Arco Sante out in Arizona as well.
Oh,
And
wonderful.
so they had such clear visions and dreams for what they were doing, right? They have their own vision. And I think going there and literally seeing their vision and kind of feeling their vision all of these years later, right? Those structures have been there for a very long time. And so it's really inspiring to say, oh my God, I can see his vision that he had all those years ago. And it made me realize that I wasn't really living out my own vision, right?
Uh-huh.
I was trying to live a version of my vision, which was a very nice vision. I was working at a great place and there was great trajectory for me. But at the end of the day, it wasn't my vision. And that's
Uh-huh.
what really became into focus. Like, in order for me to be 100% happy and 100% devoted to what I was doing, I needed to drive that bus,
Uh-huh.
right? And one of the things I learned from David Hassan and one of his amazing talents is he is really good at identifying people's talents, right? And he is also really good at putting people around him that are better at certain things than he is, right?
Uh-huh.
That man is a nucleus, right? And there's this orbit of people that revolve around him. And I was one of those people. I mean, it's a captivating orbit. It's very hard to not get sucked in there, right? And I loved it. I enjoyed it. But what I realized was like, with my personality, I also felt like I had the ability to create that same orbit of folks, right? And
Uh-huh.
I want to build my own orbit with kind of me at the center and not in an egotistical way, but to push a dream and then have people come in and guide that dream and that vision as I go through, just like he did 30 years ago. I mean, when I told him that, I was thinking about leaving, he said, "Hey, I know somebody who did the exact same thing 30 years ago." And it was
Uh-huh.
him, right? And so I was almost like following in his footsteps, which was kind of a nice idea. But I think that whole trip just really, brought it to my attention. I was really thinking about it. And then all of a sudden, there was an opportunity. Somebody I know was buying a very nice house out in Dover and
Uh-huh.
was going to sink a significant, a good amount of money into it. They were going to do an addition, renovation. It's a 5,500 square foot house. Part of it was built in 1860. Um, we were going to modernize this house. It has 3-car garage, tennis court, future pool. And, he was kind of willing to be my first client and,
Uh-huh.
was willing to sign a fairly significant design proposal and said, yeah. And I was like, so I had to do it. So it all kind of happened very fast.
Uh-huh.
Um, and then I just was like, everybody said, you got to do it. And so I just dove into that opportunity head first. And I barely had time to come up for water since, which is a
What do you
good
mi
thing.
do you mind me asking what did David say when you told him that you were gonna
He said, "I'm not surprised."
Mhm.
He said the one thing he said to me was, "Matt, I'm gonna support you no matter what. I want you to
Amazing.
stay here. I want you to continue to work with me and for me and help me run this office. But I'm gonna support you with whatever you do." And honestly, I had the conversation with him, pretty soon after I got back from Taliesin, and
Mhm.
right around this time, it was like mid-March of last year. We had started the conversation, and then when I kind of told him that there was an opportunity, he was kind of like, You got to do it." Like he was all of a sudden a supporter. Um, and, I really wouldn't have been able to make the jump without him. He did some things, I won't go into the details, but he did some things and set me up with a few things
Uh-huh.
that like it was so important for me to have those things. He really helped me lay a foundation to build a business.
Mhm.
And so I do have to give him a lot of credit for assisting me there. And I think it really kind of comes back to like we had such a strong relationship, I've known him for almost 18 years.
Mhm.
And like I told him, I wore that badge of Haseen, like a badge of honor. And, I was out there in the world promoting that office. Um, and, it just like kind of felt like it was time to do my own a little bit. I'm 42 years old, so
Mhm.
I'm old enough where I feel I have the confidence
Well,
to go out.
it's a often people ask me, what's the best way to set up a business? The majority of people, it's they usually set up a business in reaction to something. They lose their job or, they really hate where they're working at and they kind of leave like that. And often, you know, I do think a lot of people set up, not to say that you shouldn't set your business up early, like when I mean like in your late 20s, but that is young.
Right.
And actually, if I'm pushed to give it, the right way to do it, it's much more early 40s. I mean, statistically, people who set up businesses in their early 40s have a much higher level of success, across industries and architecture particularly, because you've kind of developed a core set of skills, particularly if you've been fortunate enough to work for another really good business,
Mm.
and you've picked up things and you've kind of, you've been crafted and you know the industry and you know what you're doing, as opposed to setting up very early where you're learning on the job and there's a kind of, there's more of a, there's going to be a lot more spinning your wheels, if you like. So
Absolutely.
there's a lot of advantages to that. I'm interested as well with, obviously Taliesin and Arcasanti. These are very unique projects from both Soleri and from Frank Lloyd Wright, where they are effectively being architect developer here, and in a pretty wild way as
Right.
well. So was there something about that the architect actually being the not only the designer, but they were the client themselves for these particular projects? That was the case of Arcasanti, right? He was the pretty much
Yes.
his own client
Correct.
one.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that it clearly came through kind of
Mhm,
going through those 2 projects and spending the time there. And, specifically with Wright stuff, we got a tour from he was like the director of the Wright one of the Wright Foundation arms that
mhm.
oversees that. He came and he spent the evening with us, and I actually got to sit next to him at dinner. We actually sat out, and I don't know if you've been there, but
No, I
there's a
haven't.
there's a big kind of flat plane prow in front of the house that is kind of looking out over the desert, and they set up this big table. It was about 55 people long, and they decorated with lights, and we just had a long table, had dinner as the sun set right in front of. I mean, just absolutely spectacular sunset, and I got to spend the evening next to this director, and like everything, I just asked him a gazillion questions. Right, he emailed me after the fact, was like, "Hey, I really enjoyed talking with you," but I just had never had access to somebody like him.
Mhm.
You can read things in books, but having that dialogue with him about Wright, I mean, just it was so amazing. And like he, even Wright understood the power of business development. Like
Good
Wright
one.
would throw these galas every Friday night, and he would make his students dress up in suits, and they would have to wine and dine Wright's fancy friends, right? So even all the way back then,
I didn't know that. That's
yeah,
wonderful.
it was really like, that really hit home, like, wow, like, even he understood, architecture is one thing, being a great designer is the other thing, but you need to essentially be able to, for lack of a better term, sell your work, sell
Mhm.
your ideas, right? To actually get people to pay you for the things that you wanna do. So he understood that and taught that to his staff all those years ago. And, I mean, that plays right into the kind of architect developer. Like, Wright clearly understood all of that, right? And he played all of that to his strengths. And, I don't know that that's said enough. Like, I think more architects should know some of the stuff that Wright knew, how many years ago, right? And I don't know why I
Mhm.
got lost in all this time, but for me, like that just moved up to the forefront of my mind,
Mhm.
right? And it's like, okay, well, I need to be more in control of a lot more of my
Well,
life.
he's a wonderful kind of person to consider in the business context,
Mm.
because of his ability to kind of, he created this character that was it was client focused in the sense that his clients wanted the experience of working with him because he was kind of flamboyant and eccentric, and he had this sort of persona around him
He
that was
did.
was compelling and captivating, and something like that where he's kind of putting on a gala and his team is all in suits, and he's creating an experience. He's creating a kind of client experience which was as unique as the design, and a lot of people were very hungry for that unique experience of working with him. It wasn't just about the end product, it was the whole sort of. I think that gets, and he was good at making money, he wasn't so good at keeping it. I know
As
that
I've heard, yeah.
I've heard stories of him, deliberately kind of wanting to squander money, because it kept him creatively hungry. That's not
Right.
something for another podcast, and not something that we'll advocate for here, but
Right.
the kind of creating a personal brand is what we would call it today, even down to his dress sense and his and his character and his ability with the press as well, all
Right.
masterful, all masterful.
Absolutely.
So, what about Arcasanti? Because again, that was again a very interesting kind of prototype, for an architect. What was some of the things that you took away from that particular visit that were underpinning this interest in architect developer?
Well, that one, I mean, it was just, it was so different than everything else. We also went to the Biltmore Hotel. We were there in Arizona, which is brand big,
Mhm,
fancy hotel. And then kind of to see Wright's project and to see this as a complete opposite, right? It wasn't a fancy hotel. It didn't have fancy materials. It didn't have big chandeliers. It didn't have glass walls. It was so pure and raw in terms of like its necessity to house somebody or shelter somebody
mhm,
that I found that so interesting. Just, again, for the pure contrast of what most of us think of architecture. I was there too on this trip thinking like, when was the last time I walked into a significant piece of architecture that was not a church or a museum? I don't
mm,
know when, right? I mean, when? I don't even know. So going to specifically Arcosante, which was just, these concrete forms and it was built of the earth. And he was so passionate about this movement that he got, hordes of people to come and live this lifestyle that he felt strongly about. again, it was just like inspiring that God, his vision was so clear, it was so precise. Clearly he could communicate it so well that people were just captivated by his story and
Mhm.
had to come there, give up all of their possessions, and like work in this kind of world that not many people experience probably, right? And
Mhm.
I know back at the time when it was flourishing, like now the site sits in amongst a bunch of suburban houses and stuff. But I looked back at the maps when, from the, I don't know, the 50s or something like that. And then this thing was sitting in the middle of the desert. There was nothing around it, which I think made it even more interesting and unique. Now it's like literally you do the zoom out from Google, which I did, and there's like ticky-tacky homes all around, typical Arizona suburbs, which is also kind of interesting in its own way. But yeah, just, the clear vision of that story and his real desire to kind of test all of these structures was super interesting. And now I love how they fund the whole thing by making these bells, right? Have you seen these, like, they make these beautiful cast iron.
Oh, yes, yes, I have, and
Yeah,
that's what they sell on the kind of
exactly.
in the store, if you like.
Exactly. So I love the fact, going through there was the one project that was like visual, textile, and audible, right?
Mhm.
Because of the bells, even though the bells weren't necessarily part of the architecture, they were constantly clanging and making noise as the wind blew. So visually I was stimulated. Everybody was, touching the interesting texture walls, and you can't help but hear the sound of the bells in the background. So really like that one for me tipped all the senses, which was pretty interesting.
Amazing. Great. So, I like these kind of stories of a sort of revelation that happens on an architectural pilgrimage. I'm reminded of I used to work at RSA, Richard Rogers' office in London, and he often used to tell the story of how him and Norman Foster, when they were at Yale, they went over to the West Coast and they visited all the case study houses
Wow, interesting.
and kind of immersed themselves in the residential modernism that was emerging at the time, and it was very kind of pivotal in shaping their thinking and how they would go back and kind of generate their businesses. So they're kind
Yeah.
of a powerful seed is planted, and it's really interesting to hear about these two projects, which they're kind of classics in architecture, and you come across them, but actually putting them alongside the idea of architect developer, which is something that we're big advocates here, and it's becoming increasingly a desire of many firms, is really it is very interesting, and kind of again, effectively both of these projects, Taliesin and Arcasanti, they were architect developer led models, and they're interesting because they were kind of, Arcasanti was an experiment in living and community building, and Taliesin was also a kind of education center and a kind of office. And that's a great. It's a lovely way of an architect kind of realizing certain dreams, and also nowadays we can put it into a business context of like, what does that look like as development? So perhaps we can kind of segue into what does architect developer look like in your business? So you after this trip, you had this kind of opportunity to work on a project. I'm assuming that was a kind of traditional client architect
Yes.
relationship. You jumped at that, and then where are you with the how does architect developer start to emerge here?
Well, I mean, most of my business right now is fee for service work.
Mhm,
Um, and I am very interested in doing more architect developer work. I actually had my first Butters meeting last night for a project that I'm working on. So I have a particular piece of land under agreement here in Boston
mhm,
that I am trying to get zoning relief on to build 3 townhouses. I have the land is under kind of purchase and sale. I have it under agreement. I have control of it, but I haven't purchased it, and it's all on contingency of receiving my zoning variances. And like I said, last night was the first abutters meeting in that process. Um, it went fairly well. Nobody was like kicking and screaming and yelling at me, although, a lot of the commentary was like, construction makes noise and construction draws trucks and, how's the trash truck going to get down the streets and kind of all of these things that really didn't have much to do with me or my building.
Hmm.
But, everybody has concerns around, construction happening in their neighborhood. Um, so this is a new kind of endeavor for me. Previously, I had gone kind of more the traditional routes of the architect developer where I would just identify a piece of property, I would purchase it, I would renovate it, expand it, and then sell it.
Hmm.
Um, and I did my first project in 2016. I'm Boston resident. I live in the kind of borough Jamaica Plain, and I've done all my projects here in Jamaica Plain and Rosendale. And in 2016, I actually had been hired by another developer I know to do some moonlighting. He bought a triple decker in Brookline and said, "Hey, will you help me do the design for this?" And I had been thinking about kind of architect developer work at that point in time. And I said to him, you know, I would be willing to do this, but I want to invest my fee. And I said, "You don't pay me, we'll come to an agreement on fee, invest my work." And then I also invested 25,000 in cash. So I essentially kind of invested a $50,000 investment into this triple decker. I did all the design work. He paid me some fee too, because it went on for a while. I kind of shadowed him. I brought the contractor to the table, and he redevelops this triple decker, these kind of very expensive flats in Brookline, sold them all. It was a great process. He was a good guy. At the end of that, I was like, why am I not doing this for myself? So I said to the contractor who I brought to the table, was a friend of mine, hey, like, I'm thinking of doing this. And he said, I bought and flipped some homes, years past. I got a great relationship with the bank. Why don't we go talk to him? So all
Hmm.
of a sudden we talked to the bank. Bank was on board. We had a team. He was a contractor, and I was the architect. And then all of a sudden, I identified a piece of property in Hyde Square, up not too far actually from where I live now, in a kind of merging neighborhood.
Hmm.
Had been on the market for a long time. It would needed a lot of work. It was a dump.
Hmm.
I think a lot of people said, "You're going to buy this for $775,000. You're crazy." And I was like, "No, I don't think so." And so we bought it, and we added 2,200 square foot addition to it. I turned it into
Wow.
kind of two townhouses, three
Hmm.
levels each, parking, each had their own backyard. Um, and funny story about it, we had gone through the whole process, building everything. It was a great experience for me. I really, really enjoyed it. Got to do all the design work. And I was literally working with the stager to stage the unit, the front unit, because we were going to put it on the market. And a gentleman walked in off the street and is like, "Hey, what's going on here?" And I was like, they're units. I'm going to be selling them." He goes, "Yeah, I know. I've been following. I want to buy them." And I was like, They're going on the market this weekend." He's like, "No, no, no. I want to buy them." I was like, "Yeah, yeah, pal. They're going on the market this weekend." And he was persistent. And so I gave him my email. I said, "All right, here's my email. Just contact me." I never gave it a second thought, right? I get home that night, and there's an email from this guy, and he offered me $2 million flat and was like, "I want these." And I said,
That's
"Sold."
amazing.
And
That's
so it
amazing.
was absolutely amazing. So I was in and out of that project in like nine and a
So
half
you don't have to pay any
months.
brokers fees or at all then.
No, it was just like, and I returned the staging. I had the condo docs being drafted with the lawyer. I stopped everything. Was like, I don't need any of this. He bought both units, and yeah, the kind of rest was history there.
Amazing. So do you mind talking some numbers there with that one? Because you bought it for 750. How much did you put in terms of construction and
We bought it for I think we closed on it for 775.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, we were gonna sell it for, I think, around 875 a unit each.
Right.
Which was that was so that's like 1.75. So I mean, I think at that point we were hoping to, make a couple $100,000 return on it.
Yeah.
We definitely spent a little bit more than anticipated, but then we ended up selling it for a lot more than anticipated.
Yeah.
So I think we made like 28% returns on costs on that one or something. It was a very good return. You know, we needed, this was early in the game, so I didn't have a ton of cash in there. So
Sure.
my cash investors did really, I mean, I did very well too. But,
Yeah.
the cash investors did really well. We were able to give them a really high return on the money they invested in a very short amount of time, which, you know, was bode well for us because I knew I would be asking them for money again.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, so
I
um,
mean, that's such a great story. So you're doing this as well whilst you're working at Haseen
Mhm.
as well. So your side hustle, if you like,
moonlighting. Yep,
did David know that you were doing this kind of stuff? That was all kind of
he did. Yep.
tran that's
Yeah.
that
So I
fantastic.
had, I've been doing side projects since like 2005. My stepfather was a small scale contractor, had a lot of construction friends. So I did
Right.
decks and additions. I mean, I think I did 150 side projects on my own in a small scale. Um, and so yeah, I mean, David was supporting of this and kind of knew this was going on. Obviously I tried to keep it off hours to the best of
Well,
my ability.
it's one of these things as well that it kind of, when you've got a supportive, when your day job is supportive of this sort of thing, actually there's a lot of benefit for the firm to have somebody doing this kind of like, imagine if you're one of your employees is, like, developing this skill set outside by what's their hobby? Oh, they're blooming doing development, and
Right.
their weekends are spent they're just refining those architectural skills, they're learning a whole load of new leadership skills, they're getting better with construction. I mean, that's a you kind of be excited as a business owner if your team members are doing that sort of thing,
Absolutely. I
and
think I wouldn't be surprised if that led to one of my promotions
right,
because
right,
I think he understood at that point my entrepreneurial nature, the
yeah,
fact that I was investing in myself outside of the office and that like
mm,
you said, I was developing a skill set that ultimately could be very valuable
mhm,
for him and the firm and for future things.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, it was pretty interesting. So we had kind of done that project and then, got out of it and started looking for another project.
mhm,
And then I identified another project here in JP and very similar setup to the first one. And, got it under agreement, started the construction, did the design work, we got into it. One thing I actually kind of realized as I was designing the second project was that, I was kind of developing a prototype. And because of the way Boston is built, there's a particular kind of lot type where the house is justified to the front right, and then there's a bunch of unused land in the back. And so I was kind of developing this prototype of this rear kind of addition that could be attached onto the house and slid over so it had some front facing, right? And I had done it in the first one. I had done this for the second one, deployed it a second time, and it kind of augmented a little bit as it needed to. Um, but I kind of realized, like, hey, this is actually something I could roll out to these different site types as I went. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And I did it a third time too. Um, but during the second one, one lesson learned that I like to think of with my second one is we decided to sell one of the units pre-construction. Like we were in construction, and we had been talking to the realtors and my partner's, the contractor's wife was our realtor. She had somebody that was looking for a unit that very similar to what we had. We decided, hey, let's accept this offer, right?
mhm,
We're in construction. Why not lock up a unit, right? Um, well, I think for me in hindsight, that maybe wasn't the best idea. Um,
right,
because I don't know what I thought. I think I thought at the time, like, oh, we have this under agreement. We're going to have money, we'll close a little bit faster. But in reality, this was back in 2018, 2019. We finished the project. I put the one remaining unit on the market. One open house weekend, I got an offer $100,000 over asking. And so I had sold the front unit, ended up being like the rear unit, which I went through honestly months of the client showing up on site and questioning everything and calling me for them to close like 1 week earlier than the one I had sold on market. So
mhm,
in hindsight, I realized there wasn't really much benefit to me to sell one of these, pre-market. I should have
Mhm.
just went to market with both of them. And it wasn't even really about the money. It was the fact that I had actually lost a little bit of control because I
Well,
had.
you're not the first architect to share this with me before, actually, where they've sold something like before the completion of the
Mhm.
project, which on the surface of it, it seems like it was, there's the stability that comes with it. You're de-risking the rest of the construction process, and that comes. But then all of a sudden, it's now like you've got a client,
Yeah, right.
and the dynamic suddenly shifts and change, like what you're saying. You now got somebody who's coming on site, and that can also diminish the returns of the other units that you might be developing, or just starts having it has an impact on the overall project and your efficiency in some cases.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it definitely took a little bit longer because we were kind of we were hand holding the buyer and so forth.
Mhm,
Um, but I like to think, I learned something on each of these projects. And, on that one, I definitely learned, again, this was also in the 2018, 2019 market. The market was really good. I don't
yeah,
know, if that would be the case today because the market is definitely different. But
mhm,
if I was to do it, I would really need to evaluate, what's the end run here. If it's really just to close a couple weeks early, it's not worth saving 2 weeks of carrying costs to lose that control of the project and the process.
mhm.
You know,
So, this is very, very impressive that, like, before you even launched. I mean, this is the perfect way to launch your own business. You've been doing this stuff as a side hustle, and
yeah,
I'm imagining that you were able to put a little bit of money aside so that when you kind of stepped out on your own, you had reserves, and you and your wife can kind of thoughtfully plan
absolutely.
how this is going to work, and um, all the rest of it. So how many projects had you kind of completed or been through before last summer?
So I did 3 projects, on my own, yeah, before I
Mhm,
stepped out last summer. I tried in late 2023, the market started to soften again.
mhm,
And, from when I finished my third one around sold out around 2020. Actually, we got caught in COVID. We had the project completely under construction when COVID hit. That was a very big learning experience on its own. Good Lord. We got through it. We got out of it. As you know, the real estate market just exploded. I put in, 20 offers, bids on things, just outbid cash offers. It was really, really kind of tough. So I kind of closed up shop for a while, all through 22, into 23, when the market started to soften again. Tried to buy another house 23 into 24, but it didn't quite work out because the banks were really conservative. They wouldn't comp the project out for what I wanted to comp it out as. Um, and ended up kind of backing out of the deal after I had PNS signed. And luckily I had, the right contingencies in place to get me out of the deal. I had to forfeit a few $1,000s on lawyer fees and appraisals and so
mhm,
forth. But, again, learned a lot in that process. And, because of that, it made me start thinking about, like, I need to look at this differently. I can't keep combing the market, trying to find something on market, going about this the same way I did in 2016, 17, and 18, because it's a different world. The real estate market is different. It's a different world. And so that was kind of what gave me the idea of, like, going back and seeing what's been sitting for a really long time and trying to figure out why it's been sitting, and to seeing if I can slip in and satisfy some of those needs of the sellers that maybe some other sellers weren't, which brought me to the project that I mentioned earlier that I have under agreement, where I had seen this house on the market and been sitting, 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 sitting. And it's a house that needs some work, and it's a couple that has been there for a long time, an older couple, and they're selling and they're going to get out of the city and downsize and all of that. And I started to have some conversations with the realtor, and I realized they were getting offers on the home, but they weren't getting offers with the right terms. Everybody wants to close in 30, 40 days, right? You buy a house, you want to move into your house, right?
mhm,
These folks wanted like a 6 month, 8 month closing because they needed to get their house under contract, go out, find another house, get that under contract, sell the two at the same time, and clean out this house that they've been living in for the last 30 years.
Right.
So it actually became not about money, it became about the terms. And
Hmm.
so I was able to come in and say, hey, well, I'll pay you full asking and I'll meet your terms. But
Hmm.
in order to meet your terms, I need a year to go through the zoning process so that I can get an additional unit on the lot, which makes it a viable project. Right.
Right.
And so first they said, no, we're not interested. I think part of it is they had no idea what I was even asking, right? Like
Uh-huh.
they never heard of zoning contingency or they just didn't know. I stayed in touch with them, followed up, months and months and months, talking with them, talking with them. Finally, they said, all right, we're willing to hear your proposal. Why don't you come in and meet with us? So I went in, I prepared like a little presentation, kind of who I was, what I was doing, what the process looked like, what do all these terms mean.
Hmm.
Sat down with them and they, were very interested. I also learned at that meeting that they were meeting with another developer. So all of a sudden I was competing for this project that I had just put 6 months into follow-ups, gently kind of checking in, but the realtor did tell me after the fact. She said, they met with you, and before they even met with the other developer, they decided they were going to move forward with you because the way I communicated with them, the way I just kind of simplified everything for them, and I really framed the situation as like I want this to be a win-win, right? I clearly want to get something out of this, but I also want you to get something out of this. And I'm not going to sacrifice your win for my win, right?
Hmm.
I want this to really align. We need to align here. I'm going to do this up front. I did that too, also knowing that this zoning process can take some time and I may need some extensions at the end. So I gave them a little up front. Hopefully, they'll give me a little bit in the back.
Hmm.
And we've had a really, I signed the PNS back in August, and I communicate with them every 2 weeks.
Hmm.
I've been sending them design drawings. They attended the abutters meeting last night. So it's really just been about communicating with these folks through the entire process so they know what's going on,
So,
right?
basically, you've kind of paid for the ability to purchase the house once you've gotten the approvals in place, and then they're going to get a little bit of there'll be like a new asking price based on the approvals. Is that correct? Like
Well,
or
the
have you
asking
already
price is set. Yeah.
set? Okay, fine.
It's gonna be what they wanted. They had
Hmm.
asked for a price. We have that set.
Hmm.
Um, there's really not a lot of risk for me because I'm the architect. I was
Hmm.
able to do all the design myself. I'm able to do all the kind of municipal permitting myself.
Hmm.
Um, I even worked a deal where typically they have a realtor, so
Hmm.
their realtor is going to get a fee from them. There's also their purchasing agent fee. So my attorney that I'm working with is also a real estate broker. So we are going to get the purchasing agent broker's fee. So the realtor's fee is actually going to pay my attorney for all the work that he's doing with me.
Hmm.
So I'm actually getting a fee at the end of this as well out of the real estate agent because I didn't come with an agent.
Hmm.
And that's enough to pay for the lawyer fees. It's actually going to pay for the survey.
Smart.
Um, and so, really, right now, all I have is invested in here is time. I mean, I have a lot of time invested in
Yeah.
here, and I am very committed to seeing this through. But yeah, I was able to kind of cleverly structure a deal where I didn't have to put up a lot of capital. We did a 2.5% deposit, which is refundable.
Yeah.
Um, um, and a lot of that was really just kind of laying it out for them. Like,
Mhm.
I'm not going to spend a year of my life
So so
going
so
through
so
this.
so they know then that that you've been totally transparent with them about the strategy moving forward and that you're going to
Absolutely.
that you're taking it on for a development project and there's gonna be, um, did they ask any questions about the kind of the valuation? So when you were coming to a price of, like, how much you were, because you're kind of cementing in, an asking price for it. How do you cement that in? What happens if once you get zoning, the value of the land shoots up and then they start asking for more money? Or is it's already been negotiated and they're kind of locked into the agreement?
Yeah, we have a purchase and sale agreement signed.
Right.
So there's really no
You
backing
can't.
out of that. I agreed to pay what they wanted, their asking price.
Yeah.
So there's really no negotiating back either way. They could try and obviously break the purchase and sale agreement, but that's a legal binding document.
Yeah, so you could
Um,
take leave, yeah, so you can.
Right, and I don't think we're gonna get there. They need to get out of this house. They have some mobility issues. They're living on 2 floors.
Mhm.
They need some help. And I've even offered to help them find their next home. I'm totally willing to kind of go for this ride with them because they've been on this ride with me now for the last quite a few months.
Mhm.
Um, so that's kind of a new approach that I'm trying to take.
I love
I
it.
I know I can't go out and compete in this market. People are paying way too much money for things. I don't even know if it's too much money for things, but it doesn't work on the back end. You can't buy something, invest a bunch of money into it, and then sell it for any kind of a profit at this point in time. So
Mhm.
I'm really looking for, things outside the box. I have a couple of, I'm not ready to share them here on your podcast, but I have a couple other things in the works, some other development ideas that I am, they're going to be slow to materialize. But one of them in particular has to do with some new zoning that's going to take place in the city of Boston that's about to come out.
Mhm.
And there's some real opportunities here that I'm sure a lot of people are going to capitalize on, but I would like to be one of them when this new zoning comes out. And so I have some irons in the fire there that, again, those are really long plays. It could be a couple years before something comes out of them.
Mhm.
But if something did come out of them, it could be pretty exciting for many. So it's something for me to look forward to.
I love it. What would you say to other architects who are interested in kind of pursuing this pathway, and what are your kind of more generalized thoughts about architects becoming developers? Is it a good business model? Is it something that you feel like actually can solve a lot of different problems, like actually kind of getting more housing onto onto the marketplace? Does it have the kind of creative agency that lots of architects are aspiring towards? Yeah, perhaps I can get your thoughts on the kind of more a broader context of architects becoming developers and what your thinking is about that.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely think we are really well positioned for it. I think the way architects operate, the way we think, developers do a great job at it too, but I think we approach it a little bit differently, right?
Mhm.
And, we need to learn how to one manage the finances, right? Like money is really important in development. But I think we can also have money have an equal weight to its impact, right? To its whether it's a visual impact or its community impact. We can decide to weight all of those things a little bit more evenly. Where if somebody else was doing it, they can weigh things the way they want, right? And I know as an architect, and I said it last night to the community group, like, obviously this needs to make financial sense, but I also want to have an impact, right? And, with some of my previous projects, they were very nice houses and very nice buildings. They're not going to be on the cover of Dwell, but for me, they were so gratifying as a design process. Some of the most gratifying work I've done because I had to design it. I had to figure out how to budget it, execute it. It wasn't, I didn't clad everything in marble and stuff, but like even dealing with, the kind of normal products and how do you do a really nice project that doesn't break the bank, right? That's approachable to most people. I found that to be a super interesting design challenge. And I think architects are well suited for it. I will always do fee for service work
Mhm.
because I do enjoy my clients, and a lot of my clients have been some of the people I'm working with now. They're really becoming friends. I really love that connection with them, but I also still love the control and the ability to kind of do things, test things a little bit differently as an architect-led developer. Right? I think it's going to be another tool in my toolkit. I really want to be able to kind of do both and kind of switch between the two. And again, I think, some of the client driven stuff helps inform some of the architect developers driven stuff. And I think, understanding numbers, finances, budgets, how to ask for money in an appropriate way also helps me win work with my private clients, right? Because some of my private clients are real estate developers and
Yeah.
I can speak a language with them, even though, I'm doing a private home for them. I think they just understand that I have a little bit of an understanding of it all, right? I'm not an expert in any one of these things really, but I can kind of have an intelligent conversation, about around finance, around the cost of construction. It's not just about the visual, it's not just about making the pretty picture. It's actually about something that works functionally for them as well as being beautiful, right? Those two things are tied hand in hand.
I think that kind of financial fluency is such an asset for architects, and from a client perspective, to be able to have a proper conversation about the financial mechanics of your project, and the architect to understand it and to have firsthand experience of it it's an asset. That's an
Absolutely.
asset. That's an asset for a developer. They're kind of developers I've spoken to who have worked with architects like that often very very favorable to it, and it's a good working investment for the developer in their own projects to have consultants who get it basically.
Right. Right. And I've also seen even, I've always promoted that these projects that I was selling was developed by an architect. And
Mhm.
that I've been told by some of the realtors has been received very well. Right. And I
Mhm.
think there is maybe the perception that an architect is not just going to come at this from one perspective, like I was
Mhm.
saying, right? Like the quality is there, the design intent will be there, and
Mhm.
it's worked out for me. I even offered, and it's kind of played out a couple of times. I offered, I don't know what I did. I think it was like 20 hours of design service with the sale of the house. So I said, if you buy this unit, you get 20 hours of my time. And one, actually, the first one I did, he did utilize that. We added some more cabinetry. We finished his basement, and I did all the drawings and design stuff for free because I had
Amazing.
included it as part
Amazing.
of the sale.
I love
I
that.
don't
I
know that
love that.
anybody else actually ever took me up on that, but it is there.
Yeah.
I will definitely be offering that with my latest project.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's just trying to figure out ways to introduce a little something else, right? To differentiate yourself, especially back then when the market was, it was so hot and crazy. Like anything I could do to differentiate myself or add a little bit more, was very helpful. And I think I met all of the people that have purchased my homes. I didn't sit behind, lawyer curtain. I went to closings. I wrote the condo docs with them. Some of them I even went to the banks and helped them, create the commercial bank accounts they needed to run these small associations.
Mhm.
So I was really hands on with folks because I really cared about the projects that I was developing.
Amazing. Brilliant. I think that's the perfect place to conclude the conversation there, Matthew. A very inspiring story, and hopefully have you back on the show in
I'd
a
love
little
to.
while, so we can talk about these other developments, and how you kind of further evolve the architect business model. But really, really insightful stuff. So I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today.
Yeah, thank you. I do want to say thank you to you, Ryan. Like, actually, I learned of the podcast because you interviewed David Hassine, my boss. I hadn't heard the podcast before that. I think it was 373. I listened to the podcast and immediately went back and consumed all 300 of the previous episodes. And I've listened to all 300 since. I'd even listened to all of your UK version of the
Oh, I
podcast.
love it.
I think if you asked any of my professional colleagues and friends about Matt and Business of Architecture, they'll say, "Oh yeah, Matt loves Business of Art." I just, the way you guys talk about things, you don't really hear that in the industry a lot, right? You bring these ideas forward that I found very unique and inspiring. And I really do want to commend you for that. I think it's super important. I found it very inspiring. For me to jump out on my own, it was all about confidence, right?
Mhm.
I needed to build the confidence to know that I could go out there, survive on my own, win the work. And I look back and there's all these little things that contributed to that. And I think this podcast is definitely one of them. Definitely one of them.
Amazing.
And I do have to say, on a personal note, I recently lost my father earlier this year, um, and, prior to him passing, I had to take him to a lot of appointments. And he wasn't a big talker, and, he's 80 years old. And so I ended up starting to play the Business of Architecture podcasts with him. I would save them up. And because we'd sometimes have these like 2-hour car rides, and it was like, otherwise it was just quiet. And I would save the Business of Architecture podcast, and we would listen to them together. And I don't think he ever listened to a podcast in his life before, and he would always be like, I can't believe they talk about this kind of stuff on a podcast. This is like amazing. And so, I really appreciated that. And it was something that we really could bond together over, for those 2-hour car rides. So to keep up the good work, I'm definitely going to be listening. I'd love to come back. And honestly, it was a real pleasure meeting you.
Absolute heartwarming story there. I think that's one of the most touching stories I've heard. So my condolences about your father,
Thank you very much.
and and thank you so much for your support and for listening.
Yeah, my pleasure. Can't wait to hear the next one.
And that is a wrap. Listen up, Architect Nation. While you're slaving away on that latest project that you've undercharged on, there's a $250,000 leak in your business that nobody's fixing. Your team's working overtime, clients are happy, but your bank account doesn't match the sweat equity you're pouring in. The Revenue Capacity Planner exposes exactly where you're hemorrhaging money and shows you how to capture the value you're already creating but not charging for, all in just 30 minutes. Get this tool 100% free by going to businessofarchitecture.com/capacity. So thank you to our recent listeners who left reviews for the podcast on iTunes. Your reviews help others find this podcast, so the rising tide raises all boats. To be acknowledged on the show, open up the podcast app on your iPhone, search for Business of Architecture, and after clicking on the show, scroll all the way down to the bottom to leave a review. Today's episode of Business of Architecture show is sponsored by Smart Practice TM, the world's leading step-by-step solution for small practice owners that want to structure their existing practice so the complexity of business doesn't get in the way of the architecture. Because you see, it likely isn't your architecture skills that hold you back. It's the business aspects of running a practice, managing projects, people, dealing with clients, contractors, and money. So if you're ready to quit being a glorified administrator and get back to architecture again, go to smartpracticemethod.com to discover the proven, simple, and easy to implement smart practice method that is revolutionizing firm management for firm owners and teams. Hey, Ryan Willard here, and I want to thank you for joining us today and remind you that the views expressed on this show by our guests do not represent those of the host, and we make no representation, promise, guarantee, pledge, warranty, contract, bond, or commitment except to help you conquer the world. Carpe diem.